All right. Okay, so my name is Kene Iguono. I'm the Deputy Dean for Research and Knowledge Exchange here at Middlesex University for the Faculty of Arts and Creative Industries. And it's my privilege, really, and pleasure to welcome you all here today on behalf of Middlesex University Research Community. And particularly, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our Pro-Vice Chancellor, Research and Knowledge Exchange, and Executive Dean of Faculty, Professor Caroline Upton. Welcome to our virtual Faculty of Arts and Creative Industries. And just to emphasize that I've got I was going to look behind me actually, but it's not behind me. So I've got the virtual backdrop of our lovely faculty growth building. So even though we are all virtually, just to kind of position us and to kind of give you an idea of where we are physically, if we were meeting physically. So we are delighted to have you all here. We're delighted to have Patricia Bawais and all the other members of the panel here. And of course, to everyone who is participating in today's event, we are really pleased to have you here. I'm sure more people will join us as we go on. I can see the numbers creeping up. So welcome to everyone. Professor Cobley, who is our Faculty Director of Research, has worked really hard to put this event together, and I want to acknowledge him for that. And also to my colleagues from Middlesex, from a Faculty of Arts and Creative Industries, who I can see on the screen, Professor Kurt Barlin, Dr. Sophie Knowles, and Yasmin Aliva Brown, and of course, Paul Kerr. I want to say thank you for doing this. We are really delighted to have an event of this significance here. I'm originally from Nigeria. One of my first introductions to Britain and to culture in Britain was through the BBC. So I do understand the significance of the BBC, not just only to people who live on this house, but to people all around the world. And I'm looking forward to hear a bit more about the book and about the battle against the BBC. And perhaps maybe a challenge here about if there's any role that people like me and individuals can play in that battle. So I hope that this will be a most productive evening for everyone and be interesting and stimulating discussions that will emerge from today. Just before I hand it back over to Paul for the event to start, I just want to say thank you again to Professor Patrick Bawais for coming to have this event, this talk here. I'm really looking forward to a very exciting and stimulating talk from you, and of course to the panelists who are going to be grilling you later on to ask very incisive questions that we can all listen and partake of your wise answers. So thank you very much. Hand back to Paul.
Thank you, Kenny, for that heartfelt introduction. Let's hope there's also some heart in the event as well as level-headed questions. I will just share screen now for everybody, partly to go back to that orientation slide, but also to introduce the speakers here, because we've got a number of questioners. I think that they're very well picked, a lot of them local, and certainly all of them London-based currently. So I'll just take you through them in the order in which they'll be speaking. One thing to indicate to attendees is that we had planned this event as principally a webinar, but it seems that there is some possibility to admit questions from attendees, and they can be admitted potentially if you put your hands up at the question time. Should we have enough time at the end, they can be submitted vocally or orally, or they could be submitted in the sidebar at some stage in the proceedings as well. So I will keep scanning the chat. So to introduce the official questioners, happy to introduce Paul Kerr, my colleague at Middlesex University, who is Senior Lecturer in Television Production. Then John Ellis, Professor of Media Arts, Royal Holloway, University of London. Sophie Knowles, my colleague again, Senior Lecturer in Journalism and Communications in my department, Middlesex University. Kurt Barlin, Professor of Journalism, Middlesex University. James Rogers, Reader in International Journalism, City University. Yasmin Alibi Brown, Professor of Journalism, Middlesex University. And Steve Barnett should be here with us at some stage during the proceedings. Okay, so I will stop sharing screen now and we can go back to a gallery view. So now to Paddy Barwise. And I should give a personal introduction because about 30 years ago, when I was a rookie academic, I was with a group of colleagues. We were teaching media and communications, and Paddy's name regularly came up in discussion. You know, he was someone we considered whose writing was elegant. It was eloquent about media and communication, but above all, it was hard-nosed, and that was the kind of thing that we were trying to do with our students in particular. And then when we wanted to produce textbooks in media, Paddy was one of the first persons on our list to turn to contribute. And of course, I was running a research seminar at the time, something that a job that they used to give to rookie academics. And that was when I met Paddy, because I thought we've got to invite Patrick Barwise to one of these events. And of course, amongst his attributes that I've already listed, you know, and there are many more, we had the sense that that Paddy was a bit of a futurologist as well when it came to media. And so this will give you a sense of the date. He came to speak to us about this new thing called the World Wide Web. This thing that we still didn't know how to work. We still didn't know how it would pad out as a mode of communication. We didn't know the economic model that it worked on, and he was going to tell us all of these things. So the assembled people in the seminar room waited for his first slide. When I say a slide, I mean an overhead projection slide. So that's how long ago it was. We didn't have PowerPoint in those days. And his first slide, he announced as his favorite website. There were these new things called websites, and this was his favorite. And his favorite website was Luddites Online. Do you remember that, Paddy?
I don't actually know, but it sounds a reasonable position at the time.
There were howls of laughter that I can hear almost as, you know, with as great as many decibels as there are from the silence that we have on Zoom currently. But that was the situation. So I think we can look forward to great, well, similar things from Paddy. So let me start off by a little bit of an icebreaker question. You know, nothing too tough, more in the way of Terry Wogan than David Frost. So how did this book come about? You know, I mean, how did you come to collaborate on it with Peter York, for example?
Well, as you say, Paul, many thanks for that very kind introduction. My involvement in audience research goes back a very long way to the late 1970s. And as part of that, from time to time, I've been involved with broadcasting policy. I was a little bit involved in trying to persuade the Peacock Committee in the 1980s that the BBC should not be funded by advertising, and we succeeded in persuading them of that. And then in 2008, 2009, I came up with the idea of writing a book called The BBC and Its Enemies, really based on seeing this sort of long-term trend, particularly towards cutting the funding of the BBC, which I saw as the long-term threat. And I talked to a couple of commercial publishers, and I've never published a trade book before for general readers. I've only written for other academics and for managers. And they said, well, we think this is a great idea, but it's not commercial. And so I sort of put it on ice. I then had a part-time fellowship at the Reuters Institute in Oxford in order to further research some of these issues. And with their head of research, I did a report called The Economics of Television in a Digital World, which was in 2012. And then another in early 2014 called What If There Were No BBC Television? And so this is focusing on sort of technology and economics and those sort of aspects. And the implications over the long term for the British public interest, producers as well as viewers and listeners, if the salami slicing of the BBC's funding continued for another 10, 20 years, which it certainly has. In fact, if anything, it's accelerated. And so this idea was sort of stewing around in my mind. And one of the things I do on a pro bono basis is I'm what's called a patron of the Market Research Society. And Peter York is one of the other patrons of the MRS. And the head of the MRS twisted our arms and said, will you please give the prizes at our annual awards lunch? And so we were a sort of double act and, you know, got chatting in the breaks in between. And I discovered that Peter had very similar concerns about these sort of endless attacks on the BBC. And so we decided to join forces. We started the book in early 2018. And at that time, the expression, the war against the BBC, maybe seemed a little bit over the top. Very few people, I don't think anyone's really said it's over the top now. And we got Penguin lined up to publish it. And the rest is history.
I like the way that you just say, you know, we got Penguin lined up to publish it. I mean, was it that easy?
Well, in a sense it was, and this is one advantage of you know, sparing his blushes working with Peter, is that I'd never written a trade book before. Peter, to my generation, is especially well known for a book called the Official Sloane Ranger Handbook, which incidentally sort of coincided with the invention of Princess Diana. Okay, so it's very much of that time. He was the patron saint of Sloane Rangers, but Peter sort of exists as a brand in his own right, and is sort of well known as writing for more general readers, and also complimenting me. I mean, he's also a management consultant and market researcher, more qualitative than I am. So we complemented each other. We found we got on very well, and I don't think I could have got Penguin without Peter. So having Peter's name obviously was also very important. But obviously we're delighted to have Penguin as the publisher. What we're trying to do is to reach a very wide audience and literally shift the debate to be more, to get the public to understand better the nature of these attacks on the BBC, what is driving the attacks, who's making the attacks, and so on. And Penguin is the ideal publisher for that.
The relation between the government and the BBC, it's you could say that it's perennially been under scrutiny. So, you know, bearing in mind that there have been books like Steve Barnett's book, The Battle for the BBC, from 1994. I hope Steve's going to turn up shortly. But my question is, why now?
Well, as you say, Paul, there have always been attacks. It goes right back to the general strike, even before the BBC was publicly owned. Now, my recollection of Steve and Andrew Curry's book, which I read some time ago, is that the period it deals with is the same as the Crown Series 4. In other words, it's the Margaret Thatcher premiership, which was, if you like, one of the times the BBC was under particular attack, because ideologically and otherwise, Margaret Thatcher was highly suspicious of the BBC. So it's partly because it's about a different time period, but also their book is called The Battle for the BBC, and it's really about governance and control under really the last hostile government before the current one, quite a lot of it is about personalities and about the internal politics. Our book is called The War Against the BBC, and it's about external forces, particularly those which are systematically seeking to weaken and eventually destroy the BBC as we know it. So it's not just about different time periods. We're obviously talking about the BBC's current predicament, how it got to that in the 21st century, and what are the implications for the future. But it's not only that our book is like Steve's and Andrew's, 30 years later, 40 years later. It's that what our focus is external to the BBC. It's about the war against the BBC from people who are not trying to sort of shift its direction only, but trying to diminish it, which is a very, very different context, but also they have a lot of data on what happens inside the BBC and the personalities. We haven't collected data. All our sources are published sources. So our book is exceptionally transparent in that it's got 1 million endnotes. And if you want to check on what we're saying, you can do that.
Many thanks. Paddy, let me introduce somebody who has been a producer at the BBC, my colleague, Paul Kerr, who has some questions.
Yeah, I arrived as a series producer at the BBC 30 years ago this year, and it certainly felt embattled then. But I would like to start by saying, that I really admire the case you make for the BBC and share almost all of your points. But particularly striking under COVID has been at least some aspects of the BBC have proved extremely valued by the public during lockdown. And I wondered, what kind of impact that may have and whether that can be leveraged to a case being made more generally for the BBC when and if we ever leave lockdown behind us.
I think it's a very good question. And I mean, the impact on the PSBs in general has been a mixture, because the commercial PSBs have had their revenue hit, and we've now got talk of Channel 4 being privatized coming back and things like that. The BBC hasn't had that, although COVID hasn't been financially costless for the BBC. It's sort of brought sort of knock-on costs. But I mean, the expression people use is that the BBC has had a good war, in that there is some evidence. I haven't seen hard evidence at this point of the public sort of appreciating the BBC more, nor the government appreciating the BBC more, which it should have done in the circumstances. But in terms of the market, viewing and listening are up, but it's also accelerated the adoption of online TV, which brings in more competition, including competition for content and distribution costs and so on. Overall, I think exactly as you suggest, that COVID has been net positive for the BBC. I think there is greater appreciation of what it provides, particularly trusted news and information in a context where there's more and more disinformation. And I think we're going to see the value of that over the next few months as the vaccines come on stream. Now there is evidence, an international study by Zurich University, which shows that countries that have strong PSBs have populations who are less prone to believe conspiracies, false conspiracies. And the UK is sort of, high up in the rankings. Interestingly, when it comes to refusal to have a vaccine, the developing countries have refuseniks. That people in developing countries are more aware of the benefits of modern medicine and are less likely to sort of mistrust it. But among the developed countries, we have a relatively high the last figure I saw was 79% of people saying they will have the vaccine. And, one can't sort of prove that, it's not just the BBC, it's that our broadcast news has impartiality rules, all our broadcast news, including on commercial broadcasters, and is the main source of news for people. And, maybe one day we will get some data which shows that there's a connection there. There's a sort of a subtle point here, which is, I think, there's a temptation to say that people who don't want to have the vaccine are all anti-vaxxers, meaning they believe this is a sort of Bill Gates conspiracy or one of those things. The majority of people who are what I'd call vaccine cautious are not like that. They're making the rational, they're raising the rational concern that haven't all these vaccines been rushed through rather fast? Clearly, there hasn't been time to see whether they have any long-term negative effects. Therefore, I'd rather everybody else had it before I have it myself, kind of thing. And that is not an unreasonable thing. But it seems to me that the PSBs, particularly the BBC, have an absolutely central role in, rather than sort of saying anyone who doesn't want the vaccine is a COVIDiot, is saying, well, okay, how do we evaluate these things? And what are the scientific reasons for believing that the wise thing to do, as well as the right thing to do, is to go ahead and have the vaccine? So I think that's going to come into its own. Of course, the other thing which is going to happen in the next few months is Brexit is going to crash into reality. And I think that the effects on what the wider public thinks about whether Brexit's a good idea are somewhat unpredictable. And again, I mean, the BBC is, of course, caught in the crossfire in Brexit. It's just on hiding to nothing, with everybody cross with it. I think that the BBC will probably have quite a good Brexit, as people realise that some of the concerns about Brexit, were not just sort of left liberal people who were, had all these bad attitudes about people different from themselves and so
on. The second question I wanted to ask was about how really it's a very well observed problem, but what you think the BBC can hope to do to kind of bridge the gap between the sought after young audience, which is departing from public service broadcasting, from broadcasting generally, into social media and SVODs, and the kind of existing aging broadcasting audience of BBC One, BBC Two, BBC Four, without losing the latter in order to chase the former. I mean, what is the solution to that extremely difficult problem?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is probably one of the biggest dilemmas facing Tim Davie, the new Director General. I think that the single most important thing to take away about this is that the challenge for the BBC has been made much, much worse by the funding cuts over the last 10 years, which are far deeper than most people have realized. In fact, even today, we still hear from time to time a right-wing narrative which says we've got to stop the BBC continually expanding and crowding out the market and all of this, as if the BBC were sort of constantly getting bigger. Well, Voice of the Listener and Viewer showed, using published data from the BBC itself, that the real net public funding of the BBC's core UK services, the public service broadcasting group, the real public funding has already been reduced by 30% in inflation-adjusted terms in the last 10 years. That is far deeper than most people have realized. If the BBC's real funding had simply remained constant, in other words, if its public funding had kept pace with general inflation, that would not have been enough to keep pace with the inflation in content costs driven up by the SVODs and so on, nor indeed distribution costs, because it now has to support traditional distribution and online distribution. So its distribution costs are higher as well. If its public funding had merely kept pace with general inflation, it would now be nearly 1.4 billion per annum higher than today. That would give it far more resources to address the dilemma you highlight. It wouldn't solve the problem because these trends are driven by technology trends and consumption trends, but it would give it far more resource to invest in content and services for younger viewers and listeners without abandoning the traditional audience. And so if there's one thing which we need to sort of really get more widely understood, is that the BBC has actually done a rather extraordinarily good job maintaining not just the range and quality of its services, but actually the amount of consumption with this enormous funding cut when costs are going up and the level of competition is just relentlessly increasing. But it basically, it's the money, stupid, is the big message.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I take this opportunity because we have an early question from an attendee, and it might round off the last two questions. It's from Diane Charlesworth, Paddy. She says, hasn't this, though, the re-enhancement of the BBC's reputation with the public during the COVID crisis, come at the cost of the corporation asking some crucial questions and keeping highlighted certain issues? Over time, this failure, won't it ultimately play against it? I don't know what the issues are, but I mean, one of them could be to do with the audience and the SVODs.
Well, I mean, I think that the BBC has actually sort of done a very good job serving its audience. Ofcom has just published its new report, which was widely, I should say, misreported in the right-wing press, where they cherry-picked the fact that older audiences were consuming the BBC somewhat less than before. Now, having said that, this is a service which is consumed by the British public for an average of over 2 hours a day, okay, more than the length of this seminar, right? So the idea that sort of the BBC has sort of lost its audience, the trends are tough and negative, but the extent to which the BBC has lost its audience has been enormously exaggerated. If what Diane's referring to is, should the BBC have been challenging the government more on its handling of COVID, different people would take different views on that. I think that what the BBC has tried to do and what the public has perceived is that the BBC has tried to tell it the way it is, giving the figures every day, and the figures have been grim, and then have been getting grimmer again. So there will be people who will say the BBC has been too soft on the government. There are plenty of people who say the opposite, and essentially 'twas ever thus would be my answer to that.
Okay, thank you. I think that addresses Diane's question. So now I'd like to bring on John Ellis, who I believe has also done time at the BBC.
No, I come from a very ancient wave of disruption as an independent producer. So I did some independent productions for the BBC way back, but I haven't done anything like that for a very long time. My question is, it's interesting that you should write a book. You entitle your book "The War Against the BBC," and actually, it seems as though the BBC is refusing to fight the war. But particularly, what I don't quite understand is why is the BBC so reluctant to rally people to the cause of public service broadcasting? I mean, it is a very long time since that John Cleese advert of what's the BBC done for us, you know, in the line of the Monty Python sketch. And I wonder why it is left to voluntary groups like the Voice of the Listener and Viewer, VLV, and not taken on by the BBC itself, and coming out of its corner fighting for the series of values for which underpin its very existence.
Yes, well, I agree. It's extremely frustrating. The world is absolutely full of people giving Tim Davie unsolicited advice, and they almost all describe themselves as critical friends of the BBC. Now, to any innocent bystander, some of us are genuinely critical friends. Others are, you know, wolves possibly in sheep's clothing. In some cases, they hardly bother with the sheep's clothing kind of thing. So I don't know the answer to the question. I don't know the solution. I think that it may be that this relentless attack, and it really is relentless, has led to a certain bunker mentality. It is certainly the case that were the BBC to sort of defend itself, it would then be sort of, you know, some of the attacks would redouble. I mean, I'll give you an example. I've put emphasis on the fact that its funding has been cut in real terms by 30% in the last 10 years. Nobody knows that. What is the British public's main source of information? The BBC. Now, had any other public service had its funding cut by 30% in real terms in the last 10 years, the BBC would have covered it. So it is quite extraordinary. And I have personal experience of this on 2 previous occasions. I have done quite a major piece of work, one of which was evaluating the BBC's digital TV services for the government, for Tessa Jowell, and particularly, you know, the alleged market impact. And the other was the thing I referred to, the Reuters Institute study on what if there were no BBC television, what would the impact on the market be? Both of those, the conclusions were sort of 90% positive for the BBC. The first one, the BBC entirely focused its efforts on attacking the 10% of constructive criticism. And the second one, they completely ignored. So it is extremely frustrating. Now, having said that, first of all, I think that one thing we've tried to do in this book is it's an obsessively research-based book, evidence-based book, and we are providing tons of ammunition to the BBC's friends and supporters, but also the BBC itself, which I would hope they will use because it's all out there. It's not our own research or whatever. The second thing is, I think the new DG is more likely to get on the front foot. And, you know, Peter and I have had one conversation with him in which we said, please don't circle the wagons again when we are trying to help. And Tim Davie has said, no, we get that. So cross fingers, but those of us who would like to see it more on the front foot, then, you know, any channels you've got, please use them to encourage that, because I completely agree with the sentiment.
Well, thank you. I mean, I would say it is an extremely useful book. It's a really well-written book, very accessible book, despite it being evidence-based. It's the sort of thing you can easily hand to students, because it really brings together a huge number of themes and a lot of the recent history. Things like Project Kangaroo, which is something I remember, but not many people do. And if that had been allowed, rather than prevented, it would have changed the face of broadcasting in the UK, moved it online, and left the UK market in a much different position in relation to the SVODs now.
Can I just say that for those who don't know, that Project Kangaroo was in, I think, 2009, and it was where the BBC and the other public service broadcasters wanted to do online TV collaboratively. They were referred to the competition authorities, who were heavily lobbied by particularly the Murdoch organization. And the panel of sort of economists and accountants kind of people, not people who actually knew much about TV audiences, then blocked it on competition grounds. And as you say, left the market wide open for the big American tech companies for virtually 10 years.
Yeah, I mean that is our our historic loss and a real. But the my second question really that comes on around this. It's actually it's around the question of balance, and you deal with balance in terms of party politics, almost
Mainly.
exclusively, and
Yes.
that is right, and the BBC is a far more balanced organisation, as you rightly show, than its detractors on the right and on the left will ever say. So that's right. But beyond party politics, the BBC has also applied the principle of balance, and I'm particularly thinking when it applied it to the question of global warming or global heating, as the Guardian calls it. For a very long time, that meant that the kind of shrinking pool of climate change deniers were brought onto the BBC with increasing regularity. So you had complete ignoramuses like Nigel Lawson being brought on to take on the entire scientific establishment.
Yes.
And basically what this was doing was validating fake news.
Yes.
The application of balance actually did promote fake news and the purveyors of fake news in a way that was very, very problematic. And I wonder whether you think that actually that balance has been too widely applied by the BBC onto things which haven't got a for and against, and whether the BBC should not actually revert to what it used to do, which is speak from consensus, try and speak from the centre, to try and hold the ring rather than make it into a punch-up.
Well, John, I think that actually relates also to your previous question, which is it is in our collective interest for the BBC to be more confident. And that includes believing in its own journalism. So the concept, there is accuracy, and the BBC in general, there have been few occasions where the BBC has been seen to be inaccurate or shown to be inaccurate. There's a different thing, which is what is called due impartiality, which is a slightly sort of hard to pin down thing. It's a subtle concept. And the problem comes when they do what I'd call the easy thing, which is the so-called false balance, where you say, you make sure there's somebody on side A who's arguing their case, somebody on side B who's arguing their case. And as long as you give them equal airtime, that shows you've been sort of duly impartial. And that's a very bad solution to the problem. I think for multiple reasons. Part of the temptation is the idea that sort of extremists are more entertaining than sort of centrists who say, on the one hand, it's all very complicated. And so if you're chasing ratings, I understand that as an argument, but it's still the wrong thing to do. And I think you highlighted one of the two issues where it's been particularly problematic, which is climate change. I think the other is actually the economic consequences of Brexit, where if you look at the opinions of professional economists, then there isn't an absolute consensus, but the economists who think that the short and long-term consequences of Brexit will be good for the UK, economic consequences, the percentage who think that is maybe 5%. And there's another 5, maybe 10% who say we're not completely sure. But the overwhelming majority would say that the consequences, economic consequences, are negative. So you may want Brexit because your interpretation of sovereignty means I don't care about the economy. You make that trade-off. And if you're going to do the Punch and Judy thing, then in that context, you should tell the viewer or listener that Professor X represents the minority view among economists. And also you should have journalists who are knowledgeable enough and confident enough to challenge statements which are not supported. In the case of climate change, I would say there's an even closer consensus on what's happening, not the absolute details, but the general trend. And interestingly, when Ofcom became the external regulator and also the court of last resort on complaints, in the first year, the only complaint they withheld was the one you refer to, which is where Nigel Lawson, it's not that he knows nothing about climate change. He knows quite a lot about climate change, but he has no scientific training. And so there was a complaint where he was talking about the science, debating with someone who did have was a proper climate scientist. And the BBC should have either made that clear or said, you shouldn't really be arguing the science, because Lawson's stronger position is when he said, if we accept the science, then the question is, what do we do about it? And that's a more defensible position. So I think we need to encourage the BBC to be more confident in its journalism, and confident enough to challenge people who are not talking from sort of proper evidence.
And just the final thing, that these things always end up talking about the BBC and journalism, and I'd be kind of concerned that we went wider, because one of the issues about balance here, I think it's been a real break on David Attenborough for a very long time, that he's felt unable to use the platform he has in the BBC to talk about these issues, and it's only really when he gets onto Netflix that he can speak his mind. And I think that's been a real negative constraint over a very long time. So I'd be very, this issue of balance goes far wider than...
It does, but the point you make about Netflix is extremely interesting, because one of the things which we've found is that there's a huge amount of double standards applied to the BBC. Now, Netflix refused to make a program in the state of Georgia because of its Georgia's position on abortion. Now, if the BBC were to do something like that, I mean, it doesn't bear thinking. So the enemies of the BBC, who are all very keen on Netflix and so on, because it's the market and technology and all of these things, to say, why do we still need the BBC? Actually, there was a Spectator article which we cite saying, if you think the BBC is woke, wait till you see Netflix. And so the fact that Attenborough can go on Netflix and say what he really thinks on these issues, but he can't do that on the BBC, that is because of this double standard which is applied. And then in the case of ITV, it's in between Channel 4 because it's publicly owned. The politics of it say you can criticize Channel 4 almost the same way you can criticize the BBC, but it is paid for by advertising. So ideologically, it's a little bit better. So there's a huge amount of sort of hidden ideology behind these double standards.
Okay, thank you.
John, thank you. So we've talked about confidence, albeit in a very critical way. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sophie Knowles, who's got some questions from a critical perspective, let's say. And of course, it's partly about journalism. So Sophie, go ahead.
Very much about journalism. And in some ways, what you were just talking about is a nice segue to what I have to ask, because this is very much about economic understanding that journalists have. And very recently, Laura Koonsberg started comparing our national economy to a credit card being maxed out. So you might say that shows some general lack of economic understanding, but perhaps also perhaps a lack of diversity that we see in the newsroom at the BBC as well. So what I have to ask you is this, and so it's a bit long-winded, and it's a slightly leading question as well. So there are cases where criticism about the BBC is arguably warranted. This is especially true of journalism content that lacks diversity, and content and views that are out of touch as well. Many lack the lived socio-economic experiences of the majority of the UK population. And this, of course, has a really real impact on how we understand inequality in our country. So I just want to draw from an example from Newsnight. This was just before the last general election. So we had a man from Bolton who was apparently on an income of £80,000 himself. And he said that Labour's plans to increase the income tax on people earning more than £80,000 and the claim that it would hit only the top 5% of earners was a lie. He said he's not even in the top 50%. So you had the chair, who was Fiona Bruce, who is a really brilliant chair in many other ways. She failed to tell the man that he was wrong and that he's in fact in the top 5%. So I just wonder, do you think that the BBC Newsroom is diverse enough to understand and represent the UK public and its majority?
Okay, well, there's quite a few issues embedded in that question. As you say, it's a very good segue from what John was asking about. I have to say that I think Laura Kunsberg saying the UK is maxed out on its credit card, clearly what she's doing is she's trying to use a metaphor which is sort of not using technical economics, but is trying to relate to something people find easier to understand. And I actually think it's rather a good metaphor that primarily because of COVID, the UK government has built up an enormous debt mountain, which is going to have to be paid back by future generations. And that is a little bit similar to credit card. It's the main thing, its difference is that credit card interest rates are very high, whereas what the government is hoping is that the current very low interest rates will continue. But God help us if and when they don't, because the interest payments are going to be really serious if that happens. Fiona Bruce should have challenged that person. This misperception about the income distribution among people at the top of the income distribution, who of course tend to have friends who are similar to themselves, that's quite a general thing. And the investment bankers are worse, if I can put it like that. That if you ask investment bankers, particularly young investment bankers, what they think is average earnings are in the country, then they will typically say 40 or 50,000. In other words, they sort of really haven't a clue. I think that I don't think it's right that the reason Fiona Bruce didn't challenge him was because she herself is a well-paid presenter, and from a reasonably posh background and so on. I think it's because she wasn't sufficiently on top of a sufficiently wide range of data to know that. No, I'm from a sort of privileged background, but I know roughly what the income distribution is. I would have been able to, but I'm a business school professor. So I don't think it's so much about saying you have to have a newsroom in which the only way you can have news which covers issues that are relevant to ordinary people is to have a lot of ordinary people in the newsroom. I should say that as a cautious academic, I don't have data on the BBC's newsroom, because we focused on external forces. My hunch is that the BBC's newsroom, like every other newsroom, it's not special to the BBC, it's going to be skewed towards people who are educated, people who are liberal, people who are metropolitan, people who voted Remain, people who are paid above the average, not all of them. The senior roles disproportionately going to white men, middle-aged white men, okay, as in most organizations. So I think the more tangible aspects of this, we know that Tim Davie is committed to addressing. He's talked about a 50-20-12 BBC. There's 50% women, 20% ethnic minorities, 12% disabled. very experienced manager. He's a more experienced manager than they've had for a very long time. The challenge is that diversity has so many dimensions. Those three dimensions, in the sense of the obvious, most sort of visible ones. There's another dimension, which is the BBC is understandably seen as too London-centric. So is much of life. So is the UK economy. So is the UK government, and so on. The current situation is 50% of the people who work for the BBC are out of London. The target is 70%. But my hunch is that perception still continue. You have some even more difficult things around, say, sexual orientation or gender identity, and is it the BBC's business? And we've now got this new thing in France to do with making it illegal to treat someone negatively because of their accent, literally illegal. So this is a challenge. It's a challenge which the new DG has highlighted. He's clearly working on some dimensions of it, but I think it's going to be an eternal challenge, realistically. Certainly, the idea that the people in the newsroom are going to be better educated than the general public, which has certain correlates like voting Remain, that's. You don't want a newsroom which is full of people who are less educated. Yeah. So these are very, very difficult issues to manage.
I think this is I'm speaking more about class and socioeconomic perspectives. Also, I do wonder. Just sorry to go back a couple of steps, but
sure.
Quite a number of economists did write into the BBC to complain about Laura Kuenssberg's position because. You can't really compare the national economy with a credit card, and it's actually quite irresponsible to do that because it does pave the way potentially for more austerity policies.
Well, that obviously, if that very much depends on where you're coming from. It's a simplified metaphor. I personally think it's rather a good metaphor, and I'm a sort of centrist economist without a sort of a particular agenda on austerity. So there's one question, which is this a way of explaining to the audience what it means to take on more debt than you really want, and therefore have a problem paying it back? I think it's a very good metaphor for that. If you're a probably left-leaning economist who thinks for some reason this implies that we're going to need some austerity, well, there are two ways of paying back the debt. One is to raise taxes, and the other is to cut services. So under a Tory government, a reasonable statement is our forecast is their first instinct is going to be to cut services. But that is, if you like, a political judgment. The reality is the government is going to have to raise taxes as well. So, that problem of what do we do about this debt, in my view, has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that we built up a big debt. And I think what Laura Kuenssberg was doing was explaining that as a country, we have taken on a massive debt, which is going to have to be paid back. So I think I really disagree with that criticism by those economists.
Okay, I mean, this is probably this is another debate in itself, I'm quite sure. So I'll move on really quickly. I lead the Masters in Digital Journalism for Middlesex. So of course I'm going to ask a question around digital content.
Yes.
So we've seen really brilliant flagship current affairs shows like Victoria Derbyshire cancelled, in some semblance of it has appeared online. Generally speaking, I tend to follow the BBC and its Instagram account and so forth. And it tends to follow really a similar line to the TV bulletins. There isn't that much difference, and they don't have a very large following online either. And I just wondered, do you think there needs to be more of an overhaul to ensure this, continued relevance of the BBC? To what degree is this really about funding and more to do with attitude and approach?
It's about funding. It's primarily about funding. I think that don't think people appreciate just how deep those funding cuts have been. And so it's about funding. We've talked about wanting the BBC to be more confident. Something I would love Tim Davie to do would be to get onto the front foot about the funding. And, you know, as I said to John Ellis earlier, you know, if any other public service had had its funding cut as deeply as the BBC would have talked about it, but it hasn't. So, you know, it's about the money. Now, then, if it had the money, would it do a good job along the lines you're describing? Well, maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. In the chapter on the BBC's biggest mistake, we do include one technology project in which, quite a complex technology project, in which it blew £100 million on some software which didn't work. So, you know, which is not unique to the BBC. You know, technology is difficult, particularly when you're also having to, you know, keep the aeroplane flying with this enormous number of channels and programs, which it does. I think that we say that there is a new program on the national BBC 15 times an hour, okay, mostly live. So the number of opportunities to screw up is very large. And, you know, there's this constant keeping the show on the road, as well as needing to invest in technology and so on, and all the time with the funding being relentless. So the single way in which we could solve this problem, or at least give it a better chance of solving the problem, to tackle the free TV license thing. Now you've frozen. Maybe
I just
lost check.
Last part there.
Maybe if I open my door, did I freeze to you?
Yeah, you did slightly. I just heard you at the last part. You said something about the TV license fee. I've opened
the door to get to, because my connection is better with the door open.
Okay, I'll end there. I mean, I don't want this to be, you know, the war on Patrick Farwise, but I just, you know, I guess to link the two questions that I had together there, and also to tie in with your last comment around the TV license fee. You know, if we want a younger demographic to have a buy-in with the BBC, which of course is incredibly important for media plurality and our democracy in general, super important, they need to consider the fact that young people access their news through their social mobiles more than ever before. They don't sit down to tune into TV news bulletins as much. So that needs to be sort of embedded in this new approach, I think. But,
well, I don't think we're disagreeing with that, but it does take resources. That's all I'm saying. I think that identifying the problem, you know, there's a danger of exaggerating with media. In 1995, we had people like Negroponte, who ran the MIT Media Lab, saying soon after the millennium, he meant certainly well before 2010, there wouldn't be television anymore. So, you know, particularly the techies enormously exaggerate the rate of change. Having said that, consumption patterns are changing, and they're changing more for younger people. The BBC needs to respond, but the more we salami slice the funding, the less is going to be its ability to do that. And that's the central dilemma which several of you have highlighted, and I 100% agree.
Yeah, so just as a last comment from me, I'm sorry I'll leave it there, Paul, just to say that perhaps there should be investment in their PR team. Maybe somebody needs to lobby on their behalf. That's all.
Well, a more confident BBC, including in its public communications, I would agree with that, yes.
Okay, I'll meet with her. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. I would now, Paddy, like to introduce my colleague, Kat Barlin, who is a veteran of the BBC. I hope that doesn't make you sound too old, Kat.
Veteran makes him sound very ancient, I'm afraid, yes.
Oh, okay. Well, you're on mute, by the way, at the moment.
I'm on mute.
No, Kat.
No. Oh, yes.
Yeah, veteran's okay. It comes with the territory.
Distingue, I think. Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's a very interesting debate about the BBC and its enemies from outside. But of course, the BBC for me for many years was an employer. nearly 26 years, partly as a staff employee, and then as an staff employee, and then for nearly 2 decades as a freelance. And I always used to ask myself, as an on-screen person, what is the BBC and who is it for? And the reality is the BBC is an institution, is a national institution, but it's also its people. And its people are custodians of a public discourse, which is guided by serious and reasonable editorial guidelines. All 358 pages of them. There, I've still got my copy.
Yes.
And believe me, it is. If anyone thinks the BBC is driven by bias, it's not. It's driven by guidelines like this, which actually are a good vehicle for helping journalists like me navigate through a very complex world. But one of the issues for the BBC is not just the war from the outside, it's the war within. And, you know, and if you're going to fight a war and prosecute it effectively, you need to be led by good leaders. And one of the things the BBC has suffered from over the years is poor leadership. And it keeps shooting itself in the foot. You know, you see the image behind me is an image of Selma, of course, and the battle and the struggles for equality, the battles for disrupting disparities. And of course, within the BBC, which many people would say is a liberal institution, and it holds to the idea that we're striving for a greater just society, it has served many of its people over the years extremely poorly. I hasten to add, not the leadership, who've tended to always interpret their role as something like senior leaders in private business, but many of the people within feel that they fall out of love with the BBC, even when they spend half a lifetime in it, because they are so poorly served by that leadership. So you get instances like Samira Ahmed, who has to go to court and gets trashed by the BBC in court, and then the court turns around and says, actually, you have a good case, that the BBC has not treated you fairly. And when you're working to secure the future of an institution, woe betide those leaders who don't secure first fair treatment for its employees and recognize that actually the audience it's serving is not some metropolitan elite or intellectual elite. It's serving the broadest, it's a broadcaster. It's serving the broadest possible audience, notwithstanding the financial consequences of cuts. It's still there to serve the broadest audience. And the fact of the matter is Britain is very diverse, but the BBC is not. And to survive, it simply has to change.
Well, again, there's quite a few sort of issues in there. As I said, sort of at the top, our book is about the external forces. So, you know, we don't have data on what's going on inside the BBC. And so I'm unable to I'm not in a position to judge the extent of the validity of what you're saying about the internal culture. Of course, I know that everyone at the BBC sort of is highly critical of the management and the leadership, and also says that W1A is a parody, but it's a parody which is very, very grounded in the reality. I think we need to distinguish between what goes on air and what goes on inside. And in our book, we've really been focusing more on the external forces, but also what goes on air, because a lot of the accusations are about what goes on air being biased in various ways, and you know, misleading and so on. Interestingly, among the people we talk about in the book, the current overwhelming strand of that accusation is that the BBC is too woke and going on too much, particularly about race and sexual orientation and all those things. Now, the nature of that is it's an ink blot test, that, you know, what you see is about the interaction between what's on the screen in front of you and what what you bring to your interpretation of the screen in front of you. Now, having said that, we do sort of touch on some of the internal issues you talk about, and so the Naga Muncietti, for instance, who where the BBC sort of got its really got its knickers in a twist, I have to say, in which the male white co-presenter wrongly asked her what she felt about a Trump statement, which was, to any reasonable person, a racist statement. He shouldn't have asked her that. She probably shouldn't have responded either. And then the BBC got into sort of all sorts of a mess. Interestingly, I think it may have been Newswatch or one of the anti-BBC organisations specifically said that the BBC had sort of let itself off too lightly about that, or maybe it said that Ofcom had let itself off too lightly. So, of course, it has an issue. Of course, it needs to do more. I haven't seen any evidence that this is more true of the BBC than of anyone else. And when it comes to particularly the gender pay gap, the sheer hypocrisy of some of the right-wing newspapers with much larger gender pay gaps making a big issue of the BBC's gender pay gap. Now, that doesn't mean that the BBC's gender pay gap is okay, because it isn't. And if the BBC is claiming that the only reason for that pay gap is because it has more senior men than senior women, which isn't true. That's not the whole explanation, because people at the same level, like Carrie Gracie, was able to show that she was being paid less than a man who was at the same level. Of course, they've got to fix that. And I think they were slow on the uptake in slightly thinking this was sort of about the money rather than about treating people equally on the basis of the quality of their work rather than who they are in other respects. So I think, I don't think we're a million miles apart. I do think it's a more difficult challenge than some of its critics, particularly people who don't actually have leadership experience themselves. These are more difficult issues to tackle than they might appear. I mean, if you take positive discrimination as an example, a situation where you describe yourself as an equal opportunity employer, but in reality, the senior jobs have all gone to people who are pale, male, and stale. Or well, the crucial thing is pale and male. So therefore, in order to fix that, you lean in a little bit, so that if you've got two equally capable candidates, you would tend to give it to the one who is a bit more working class, give it to the female, you'd give it to someone from an ethnic minority, which is a pragmatic way of addressing the problem. If the perception is that she got the job when the other candidate was better, that has a lot of unintended consequences. So this is a pretty nuanced issue, which is tricky to tackle. But if we were to say the BBC needs to do more, I think we'd find Tim Davie completely agreed. And when we say more, it needs to accelerate the rate at which it's tackling this. So that's not a very good answer.
No, I mean, on one level, Patrick, I agree with you. On another level, I fundamentally disagree. The BBC is one of the greatest British institutions, like the NHS. Therefore, it has a greater responsibility to tackle those tough problems. There's no point saying, the Daily Mail doesn't do it, and
I don't disagree. I don't disagree with that.
But there,
I think what we have, if we're going to, Kurt, let me finish. If we're going to apply a higher standard to the BBC, which I think is reasonable, let's at least be clear that that's what we're doing. That's what
I think it's important.
So did I cut you?
No, that's fine. That's fine. I think it's important that we do. Now, there's a second point here of where I'm driving at, and that's that should the BBC be a true reflection of the audience it serves? That doesn't mean the newsroom is stuffed with ordinary people, as you put it earlier, but that the BBC genuinely must reflect in its output the concerns of its audience. And how can people support the BBC if they don't believe they have a genuine stake in that institution because of what it does, either how it looks or what it provides the audience with in terms of content across its platform? It's not just about BBC One television, it's about Radio 4, Radio 5, it's about the regional broadcasters and the regional stations. The BBC is a huge network. Not that too often we concentrate on BBC One and BBC Two television, but actually you've got local radio stations, obviously you've got internet outlets now, but the reality is all of those outlets need to serve the audience, and it needs to reflect the people who we have become. And we are no longer 1960s, 1970s pale and stale, as you say. We are a very different community, and if we don't learn to serve that within the BBC and the leadership cannot demonstrate that, how can it possibly win the argument?
Well, I think that, as I said before, you have to distinguish between what's the composition of the people within, especially that newsroom, but also more generally, and what goes on air, on the screen and on the radio. And if the question is, has the BBC lost touch with the wider audience, then I would say it hasn't. And so, I mean, we have a chapter in the book called Vox Populi. I think we call it Vox Populi, Vox Dei. By the way, Vox Pops, I think, are a particularly bad solution to this problem. The idea of showing that you're in touch with people in the red wall constituencies, which is what everyone in Westminster is currently sort of obsessed with, by sending a journalist or local journalist from the BBC to interview a few people in the street, on the issue. It's an easy thing to do, but I think it's sort of the wrong thing to do, because it doesn't really engage the audience very well. The idea that the BBC's services sort of only appeal to the liberal metropolitan elite, that is sort of demonstrably false. And the people who make that accusation are primarily on the right. I'm thinking of, Philip Davies MP, who's sort of notorious bean basher I was debating with sort of recently, who's sort of very sort of what I call a professional northerner kind of thing. And, let's look at what the data say. Okay, that the data say that the BBC is consumed by sort of, the only time we've looked at the household consumption of the BBC services over a week, it was 99%. Okay, so so for instance, the argument that the license fee, why should people pay for the license fee if they don't consume the BBC services? Well, there aren't any people like that. No one's ever produced any evidence. Now, having said that, there are two big provisos. One of them is the BBC is still, and even if 70% of its, when we get to the point quite soon where 70% of its employees are not based in London, they will still be atypical of the wider population. And it will still, the biggest jobs are going to be in London. A lot of the news is coming from London. People in Scotland will say it's not enough about Scotland. People will say it is too London-centric. Okay, and I think that is actually an insoluble problem. All you can do is work towards getting closer to solving it, but I don't think you'll ever solve it. In terms of understanding people away from London, people different from the broadcasters. Well, you know, professionally, I'm a marketer. As it happens, so is the current general. And in marketing, a lot of what you're doing is based on doing your best to understand people different from yourself, using as many sources of insight as possible. And obviously, it's helpful if some of the people making those decisions have personal experience, which is similar to the people in the market you're trying to serve. As a second best, it's important to spend some time with people different from yourself who you're trying to serve. And as it happens, Tim Davies started his life at one of the great marketing universities, which is Procter & Gamble. Now, the chief executive who turned round P&G when it was really losing its way around the year 2000, and P&G has always been very good at using formal market research. And he said, that's not good enough. You need to spend time with the people we're serving. And if that's an issue in the US, think what it's like in Mexico. If you think of the world of the senior P&G manager and the world of the average Mexican housewife, they are very different. And you can't solve that problem by reading reports or even watching short clips of, you know, her talking to camera. You have to go and spend, you know, half a day with her in her home with her family, talking about things that matter to her, which won't start off with how clean her laundry is compared to the neighbor's laundry. It has to be in her terms. And again, because this is sort of meat and drink to the new DG, I'm optimistic that that idea of saying we really need to get closer to the people we're serving across the whole country. He's a great believer in the universal BBC. He's already put his head above the parapet saying we do not want to be a subscription service. We could do it, we'd do it well, but that would mean we weren't universal. The other thing which I know he's concerned about is the 30% of individuals, not households, who perceive themselves as getting least value, and they're the ones who are consuming, you know, the least amount. So this is very, very much on his agenda. I think he's a very good leader. We'll see how well he tackles it.
Thank you.
Paddy, I just wanted to take chair's privilege for a moment. I'm not doing this just because Kurt's one of my colleagues, but there's a point here in strict relation to the book, and that is that you make this very strong argument that those who wage war on the BBC don't represent the consensus, because when people are surveyed, they subscribe to none of those views or very few of those views.
Well, but the ones, or insofar as, and particularly on impartiality, insofar as people say the BBC isn't impartial, which is almost 50% of people, they disagree with each other about which way the bias goes. Okay. Yes.
But I mean, putting the question in very plain terms, you've talked about marketing, but I think Kurt's question was about culture. What do we do if these people don't represent the war wagers? Then, you know, do we simply get close to them, or do we change the culture by bringing them in, or is it the case that we're representing, or the BBC is representing the public sufficiently well that we can just leave things the way they are?
We certainly can't leave things the way we are, but this is essentially a never-ending struggle. And the people on the right who are attacking the BBC, many of them are clearly populists, and they claim to be speaking for the majority. In fact, one of our conjectures, we haven't got proof of this, but one of our conjectures about why is it that across the wider population, particularly on the left-right thing, which is the thing which has been best researched, broadly, the people who lean to the right and tend to be older tend to think the BBC leans left, and vice versa at the other extreme. It's not completely symmetric. There are slightly more people who think the BBC leans left than think it leans right, whereas the content analysis shows it slightly goes the other way. But we have that sort of set of views. It's a spectrum of views for the wider population. But when we look at these organized attacks on the BBC, we find that, Corbyn supporters were very indignant. They thought the BBC, certainly not uniquely the BBC, but the BBC was hostile to Corbyn. But the overwhelming majority of the systematic, organized, pretty well funded attacks on the BBC are from the right. And we think there are several reasons for that. The main one being a resource imbalance, that these people on the right are better resourced and are able to influence more of the newspapers than people on the left, because clearly our newspapers tend to skew to the right. But we think that there's another ideological reason, which is the BBC being publicly funded. Automatically, people who disapprove of public services disapprove of the BBC. There are some commercial vested interests which tend to be on the right. So Rupert Murdoch has clear commercial vested interest in making the BBC smaller and weaker. But we think there's an additional thing, which is what we call the silent majority illusion. And I would love some of the media studies academics to actually get some data on this, which is our hunch is that people on the right are more likely to believe they represent the majority in criticizing the BBC for being too left-wing than the equivalent mirror image on the left. It's actually not a mirror image. And I hope we can possibly provoke you or your colleagues at Middlesex or other media studies scholars to actually collect some data and see whether this is true. It's not a very difficult thing to test. It's quite a complicated story because there's this mismatch between what the book's about, which is the war against the BBC, and the views of the public, which are not, the public doesn't have a consensus about the BBC, it has a spectrum. But when you ask which source of news, which is the one source of news you would be most likely to turn to for impartial news and for news you trust, the BBC absolutely dominates.
Okay, Paddy, thanks very much for that. Let's press on. With the best will in the world, I think any discussion of the BBC could be accused from the outside of being somewhat parochial. So I'd like to introduce now an international perspective, and I'm going to bring on James Rogers from City University.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Patrick, for a very interesting book. I mean, as Paul said, I too am ex-BBC. I spent most of my time there in international news. I was a correspondent in Moscow, in Brussels, and in Gaza, and also from where I covered the Iraq War too. Mm-hmm. One of the trends that I noticed, of course, during my time overseas, which was from the late 1990s until about 10 years ago, was the increasing number of English language television channels that were set up by other, in most cases, governments. I'm thinking, of course, of Al Jazeera English, TRT, TRT World, the Turkish channel, China Global Television Network. And you, of course, write at some length in the book about RT. But what I wanted to ask you is, how do you think the BBC can continue to thrive in this global media environment where the things which started as imitators to an extent were actually used frequently for propaganda purposes, sometimes disinformation purposes? How can the BBC continue to thrive internationally in that kind of environment?
Right. Well, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but it's the money. And I think that were you at the World Service when it became part of the BBC, part of this, in terms of the funding and the news organisation, or were you probably close to people who were?
Yes, I was.
Because I know there was.
I left in 2010, so that process was underway, but it hadn't been completed by the time I left.
Right. So what I know is that there was a great deal of nervousness about it at the time, and the feeling was that the World Service will just get subsumed within this huge sort of UK organisation, and I was, I think, in my sort of rather few interactions with World Service people, but also sort of politicians worrying about it. So the Foreign Affairs Committee, Select Committee, was very worried about it. And my view was, you actually shouldn't be worried about it. except insofar as the BBC is having its funding salami sliced, because culturally and ideologically, as well as in terms of realpolitik, my expectation was that within the resources available to the BBC, it would not want, and it would be very foolish of the BBC to reduce the percentage of its resources which it allocated to the World Service. The reason for that is that even Paul Dacre knows that the World Service is an absolute jewel in the UK's crown. Okay, that right-wing politicians realise the value of the World Service. They're constantly hearing it from elsewhere. The very fact that the Russians constantly trying to undermine it, the fact that the Chinese got Rupert Murdoch to drop the BBC from the Star satellite, that it causes so much fear to authoritarian regimes is in itself, I would argue, proof of its value. And it's possible that, again, we haven't looked at this in terms of the British public, who, for instance, are in favour of DFID being made smaller and foreign aid being cut and things like that. So were the British public to be asked the question, they'd probably need a little bit of context. They might well say, no, well, can we please spend less on that? I don't know that. But among the political classes, and that includes, newspaper editors and the people we're talking about in the book who are systematically hostile to the BBC, the great majority of them are hugely supportive of the World Service. So I'm afraid it keeps coming back to the money, and the money is not the money for the World Service, it's the money for the BBC, because I think that both in terms of ideology and in terms of realpolitik, the BBC will always do its best to protect, the proportion of its funding which goes to the World Service. And of course, as you know, the BBC's non-UK audience is growing extremely fast, and it's growing extremely fast in a world of increasing, not merely misinformation, but deliberate disinformation, much of it state-sponsored, not only through the channels you mentioned, but of course, a lot of it using online channels. And the government is on the case. They haven't necessarily made the connection between the role of the BBC globally and the fact that we need to tackle disinformation, which the anti-vax thing is going to sort of bring out in spades. But I don't think it will take very much effort from people who've thought about it to sort of make that connection. But we need to do it, and we need to shout about it, and use your networks.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a bit difficult to know what the government can do, of course. I mean, because, my last question was going to be, what can or should the government do to support the BBC in the international arena? But of course, when the government gives extra funding, for example, for Russian services, this simply gives RT or the Russian foreign ministry an excuse to turn around and say, well, wait a minute, RT's just the same as the BBC. That's all we're trying to do. They're putting across a British point of view. We're putting across a Russian point of view. So it's quite a difficult challenge for them, isn't it?
I think it is a difficult challenge, and but it's still the case that the populations, and not only in places like Russia and China, but also India, for instance, where people rely very heavily on social media from people they know, and they think, if it's come from my cousin, it must be true, kind of thing. So the BBC, which is a huge trusted brand in India, in my view, the solution is ensure that the BBC is properly funded. And the single thing which would do that would be for free TV licenses for households with over 75s to be funded out of general taxation the way they were when Gordon Brown introduced that. And then as part of your governance of the BBC, you say, of course, we expect you to protect the funding of the BBC World Service, and we certainly would expect you to talk to the FCO or whatever it's called these days. And for reasons of geopolitics, we think it's particularly important to provide trusted news to the following populations. And of course, the Russians will say what the Russians will say, but you know, even their own populations won't believe them that much. So I think that directly funding stuff which can then be represented in the way you've described is the wrong way to go. And in my view, the indirect route is the right way to go. But as you've said, it's quite a nuanced issue, and it's possible to use that indirect route and still say, you know, let's talk about priorities. And certainly the bigger that global audience gets, and typically the BBC, when it talks about its global audience, excludes the UK. I mean, because it's said before, I mean, several people have said the BBC is incredibly bad at making its own case. And in the case of its global audience, you know, Google does not exclude the US, you know, its US users when it talks about its global, how many global users it has. Only the BBC does. So I'd like to see the BBC including, you know, the 60 million people in the UK, in which case it already has a weekly audience of more than 500 million and growing, and we should be shouting about that. And we should be collecting data on, you know, where we're allowed to collect data on which sources are trusted. So for instance, in the last US election, the BBC was the most trusted source by the US population, you know, across the political divide as well. And we should be shouting more about that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, James. Paddy, I would like to change tack very, very slightly now. I won't call them wildcards, but Yasmin Alibi-Brown and Steve Barnett, who I'm delighted to say has now joined us, they promised to provide very, very topical questions. So taking them in order, if we could kick off with Yasmin. Okay, Yasmin, is your microphone unmuted?
Colin?
Ah, there we go.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
We
Hi.
can hear, we can't see you, but that's okay.
That's okay. Thank you for that. And as you know, I did a rave review of your book the other day.
Thank you.
Review, a column. And listening to the questions and answers has been really fascinating. The thing is this, it's really hard, and in part this relates to what Kurt was saying. It's the BBC today is like a lover. You love it, but you cannot at times bear it, because so much has been done that I think has kind of failed its most loyal people. I'm not even making a left-right point. How do you defend the BBC when you have seen some of its decisions? Having Nigel Farage on Question Time 31 times when his party never had an MP. It relates to what you were saying, Paddy, about confidence. And I would say it's the other side, the cowardice, the institutional cowardice that has led sometimes to this disenchantment. So the sorts of decisions that are made to placate the people who are not even off the normal right, but actually quite far down another road. Then you see some of the sexism and racism allegations. You see the right overrepresented in its leading figures, and nobody at the BBC as yet explained how come so many of their leading lights have gone on immediately to join the Tory party and become their advisors and their key figures. And the last one is Allegra Stratton. I've just listed at least 8 of them, and I would also throw in Andrew Neil. They may be very good at their jobs being impartial at the BBC, but a part of you begins to suspect that the cowardice was part of the problem, that they gave in to the pressures and actually lost the love of poor people who were with them. And I think they need to really readjust that. And also, and somebody else has said this recently in this seminar, when you have the Taxpayers Alliance on the number of times they do, it is the duty of the BBC to tell us who they are. It is the duty of the BBC to tell us this is a right-wing or a left-wing think tank funded by unknown sources. So the information, the people who are listening have this information. And there have been so many such failures in the last 2 years that I begin to wonder whether that massive culture change, which would also be about diversity, and actually they're doing a very big thing on diversity with June Sarpong, who's really taken hold of this. But I fear that the politics of cowardice within the BBC has damaged the BBC more than it cares to acknowledge. If these people had joined the Labour Party one after another, or been like John Humphreys and Jeremy Paxman, Gitta Harry, Craig Oliver, Robbie Gibbs, what would have happened? And yet the BBC has never properly confronted this.
Well, I mean, I think that was, in a sense, more a statement than the question. Of course, it's a statement with which I have a lot of agreement, and which we talk about quite a lot in the book, and we have in during the seminar talked about. I think Brexit is a particular case where the BBC really was on a hiding to nothing, because it's so divisive, and I think it's pretty much unprecedented to have a situation where as you say, the sort of the BBC's natural supporters, who tend to be centrists, have been disappointed and would like it to have been tougher and more confident, maybe not held its enemies quite so closely to its bosom, using your lover analogy. And you know, the famous, as Andrew Adonis has said, 31 or 32 times and counting Farage appearances. While I have to say, of course, Farage has never been an MP. He does, however, represent you know, quite a lot of public opinion, and you know that opinion does have to be represented. Interestingly, on sort of the EU and Brexit, one of our frustrations, I mean, we had a general frustration in dealing with the accusations of bias, in that there's been quite a lot of good academic research, but no one had done a book, or even what in academia we call a review paper, which is pulling together all the academic research in a structured way to say, well, what is the picture which emerges? So we found, we particularly drew on one group, which is the Cardiff group, which has done more research on broadcast impartiality than anyone else. But even they hadn't done, if you like, the review paper on their own research, never mind the research at other places. So we had to do it ourselves, and it's an appendix in the book, and then we summarize it in the main part of the book. And one of the provocations I'm sort of issuing to media studies academics is, in order to have more impact, you know, please pull together the research which has been done. Now, there is a problem in academia, which is, as we all know, academics are judged mainly by their academic impact, which is, you know, the number of citations by other academics. I know that Paul today has been suffering from putting together the research excellence framework document, which I'm very happy to say I no longer have to do that kind of thing, and it's not a fun thing. And so the current REF, attempts to say, well, what about real world impact? And I would love to see more attempt to pull together the research. Now, of course, the Daily Mail will be reluctant to report it, but nevertheless, there are channels, particularly, actually what we've tried to do in this book, which is to draw on academic research and other evidence with Penguin and trying to reach a lot of people. So I would love to see the academics do more. Now, having said that, as we've said several times this evening, we should all be encouraging the BBC to make that case itself. We should be encouraging braver journalism, so that if we have a Brexiteer making claims or a Remainer making claims which aren't actually supported by the evidence, that rather than just relying on someone on the other side to challenge them, you have journalists who have both the information and the confidence to say, well, actually, this is the evidence we've got. I think that what we describe in the book may help to explain this sort of bunker mentality, which is sort of very defensive and tends to circle the wagons rather than being confident. There's a sort of twist right at the end of the chapter on the BBC's biggest mistakes, which starts off with Savile, which is obviously very high profile and was very damaging. But right at the end of the chapter, and we've talked about all sorts of managerial mistakes, editorial mistakes, and so on. Right at the end, we say, but it's in the interests of the British public to have a BBC more willing to stick its neck out, more willing to take risks. If it does that, it will make more mistakes. And right at the end of that chapter, we say, we wish this had been a longer chapter. Okay, in other words, we'd had a braver BBC, a more risk-taking BBC, which would have then made more mistakes. So, I completely agree. Interestingly, you mentioned June Sarpong. And a couple of the interrogators have particularly focused on diversity, and we all agree it needs to do more. Having said that, when the BBC repurposed 100 million of its investment, not an incremental 100 million, just a repurposed 100 million, and appointed June Sarpong, there was quite a lot of criticism from the usual sources saying typical woke BBC, going on and on about political correctness and all of that. And so, when we are criticizing the BBC, which we all do, we all find the BBC, my goodness, it's frustrating to deal with. It's very hard to help, right? Because as I said earlier, if you write something which is 90% supportive, 10% constructive criticism, its energy goes into trying to sort of undermine the 10% rather than saying, using the 90% to get on the front foot and make its own case. But we should all be encouraging it to be more courageous. And now we've got a new Director General, I think we have a chance. But whatever it is which accounts for this sort of ultra cautious culture, we should be encouraging it to be braver across all fronts.
Thank you. That's a brilliant, really complicated answer and an important one. I do want to suggest to you that the reason Farage became more popular is because the BBC kept giving him that special seat. He didn't begin with the BBC gave him the free publicity he sought. So there is a connection here that they've never taken responsibility for. And the second point is this.
So can I just interrupt you there, Yasmin? That is clearly partly true, but we mustn't underestimate the role of newspapers. Now, in a world of Google and Facebook and all of that, people tend to think, well, the newspapers are, you know, a 19th and 20th century, you know, technology, it doesn't matter anymore. The newspapers set the political agenda for all media. So the not just the BBCs, but all broadcasters' political coverage is hugely influenced by the newspapers, as are social media. So, you know, what I get from Apple, you know, my Apple News is selected particularly from newspapers. And by the way, one of the things which really none of the evidence sort of shows is a big difference between the BBC's news and current affairs coverage and that of the other broadcasters. So Sky News and the commercial PSBs. So it, you know, as we've said in terms of employment practices, there are reasons why we try and hold the BBC to a higher standard, and we should do that. But let's be clear that that's what we're doing, and we should also hold the other broadcasters' feet to the fire as well.
Okay, last point. Also got to be like with climate change. Racism is not a point of view. And the BBC in recent years has been treating it as a point of view and succumbing to the pressures from actually emboldened racists who have come back into the public space with quite a virulent, and I've worked for the British newspapers for over 35 years. I know the industry and I know the symbiotic relationship between the papers and the BBC. But the BBC has given too much credence to certain kinds of newspapers and been too cowardly to actually look at the other side. And that happened with the immigration debate too, with Andrew Green being foregrounded over and over without any due care. So that's my last point. Thank you so much.
Yasmin, I agree.
Many thanks, Yasmin. I'd like now to bring on Steve Barnett, if that's possible. And you promised topical questions, ripped from the news headlines.
Breaking news. Actually, before I come to that, this really is breaking news. So I'm not going to disappoint you, Paul. But before I come to that, I want to push back a little bit on the dreadful slur that has been proposed to media academics and the lack of research or the lack of putting together of work on impartiality. I mean, I think Paddy has done an absolutely fantastic job in putting together the work that's been done. It may not have all been put together in one place, but there is plenty of work that's been done over the years. And I've put one piece in the chat, which I do frequently quote when I'm also doing battle with the sort of hard right dinosaurs like Davis, etc., which demonstrated quite clearly on the back of academic research that the BBC reproduces a Eurosceptic conservative agenda. So that work is there. What I think Paddy's done, Paddy and Peter have done superbly, is not just pulled it together, but actually made the critical point, and it comes back to the resources issue, that much of the work that demonstrates that the BBC is left-wing or too liberal is actually politically funded research. It is research that is quite clearly comes from a particular perspective. It is funded by right-wing groups and it has no academic credibility whatsoever. Whereas the work that tends to find that the BBC is a bit, or sometimes very, biased to the right, and I've quoted the Cardiff study and there are others, virtually all, maybe all without exclusion, comes from academically accredited studies, peer reviewed and methodologically sound. So I think that point has never really been properly demonstrated. And I think the crucial thing that I think we've all got to remember is the inequality of arms that Paddy talked about earlier. The right wing funded, the politically funded right-wing think tanks, the IEA, Policy Exchange, Taxpayer Alliance, the money that's come across from Robert Mercer and the Koch brothers in the States have changed the narrative in the UK. And I think the BBC is a victim of that. Right, that's enough of me ranting. Paddy can disagree if he wants. This is my breaking news question. So,
right.
Jim Waterson.
Sorry, I don't, can I just say, I don't disagree with you, but there's one word you didn't use, which I know you'll agree with me, and that is opaquely funded. Okay, that if we had transparency about who is providing the funding for Newswatch and the right-wing think tanks, that would say a lot about what their agenda is. Okay, so transparency is very important, and we don't have it. So there's a lot of dark money funding these think tanks.
I agree, but it's not all that dark. And The Guardian had a good piece, which I've also just put in chat, which exposed some of it. And maybe coming back to what I think Yasmin was saying, is that the BBC ought to be telling us where that money's coming from, because a lot of it is known about. Taxpayers Alliance is one of them. Okay, this is my question. So Jim Waterson posted at about while you were speaking at 4 o'clock this afternoon, saying Rupert Murdoch's News UK TV channel given approval to launch. Okay, so News UK TV has been given the go-ahead by Ofcom to start broadcasting as soon as it's ready. This is alongside GB News. So my question is, what does that tell us about Ofcom's approach to impartiality, and what are the implications for the BBC?
Well, just to step back a bit, of course, we know where this originally came from, because it was The Guardian in January of this year, which dug into the recesses of the internet and found Dominic Cummings's infamous 2004 blog posts about what we should do to improve the UK media ecology. And there was really no pretense that this was about the public interest. This was purely about party political benefit. And so there was a strategy which included, number one, top of the list, was weakening and defunding the BBC. It also included removal of all limits on political advertising. And we've just seen the US election and the effects of having enormous amounts of money going into the political process. Number three was right-wing shock jock phone-in news, radio news, but it also included a UK Fox News. And so from Dominic Cummings's viewpoint, what we're now, I would think he hopes to see, is not one, but two UK equivalents of Fox News. So coming directly to your question, what does this say about Ofcom? What does it mean for the BBC? Well, what it says about Ofcom is the proposal they were given was sufficiently credible that they accepted that, as written, it will fall within the guidelines of impartiality. Okay, that it's not just the BBC; it's all UK broadcast news and current affairs has to be duly impartial. And so I assume that what the proposal talked about was the enormous efforts they're going to make with an advisory board and goodness knows what to show their independence and this, that, and the other. The proof of the pudding will be in the eating, as incidentally will the slight mea culpa we've had from the surviving Koch brother. I'm rather skeptical about the extent of this Pauline conversion, which was alleged Pauline conversion before he goes to meet his maker alongside his brother, but we shall see. As a marketer, I'm an eternal optimist, and so we live in hope. So it's possible that this or both these news services will indeed not be right-leaning. That is clearly not what they're intended to be. So we've had this interesting thing with Rupert's organisation that Fox News which has now fallen out with Trump because he really is a loser. But Fox News over the years has obviously had an enormous impact on the divisiveness of the US, and playing to the base and so on. Arguably, without Fox News, there wouldn't have been Trump as the 45th president, and so on. And they had to drop their slogan, fair and balanced, because it got mocked so much. And when it existed over here, A, nobody watched it, and B, it also somewhat fell foul of Ofcom. So at the same time, you've got Sky News, which has been, now that Sky News is no longer part of the Murdoch organization, there's a question about, will the funding continue? But Sky News has never been, remotely comparable to Fox News in terms of political bias. So the question is, having accepted the proposal, and the same is true for GB News, the people behind both of them, in fact, I think it's GB News, which has the Liberty Global person who describes the BBC as, the most biased propaganda outfit on the planet kind of thing, which is not an encouraging sign. The question is, step one is persuading Ofcom that you've put together a plausible proposal which says you're going to operate within the guidelines. Now, the organization which fell out of those guidelines was RT. So, Ofcom has certainly shown itself capable of policing it. And by the way, in a direct, explicit tit for tat, the Russians then gave the BBC, in the Russian language BBC, an extra kicking in direct retaliation for RT losing its license in the UK. So stage one is persuading Ofcom that you've put together a plausible proposal. Step two is, do you then broadcast impartial news, or do you test the boundary? And the empirical question is, how far can that boundary be tested? And I don't think we know the answer to that. So Times Radio, which already exists, is sort of based on the Times, but I don't think there have been any sort of major scandals about it. I gather that Rupert thinks it's rather boring, and why are you spending my money on it? But some people would say LBC isn't that impartial either. So these are slightly sort of nuanced issues, and I think the jury is out, frankly. Clearly, the intention behind launching these two news services is as part of what Dominic Cummings wrote in 2004. It's a part of shifting the center of gravity of political dialogue in the UK to the right, as Fox did very successfully. But in the US, for First Amendment reasons and all sorts of reasons, there is no commitment in broadcast news to impartiality. In the UK, there is no commitment in newspapers to impartiality. We do have rules for all broadcast news in the UK to impartiality, and we have a regulator, and we can have a conversation in 12 months' time to say what happened. What did it shift the boundaries? Did Ofcom face it down, or did Ofcom, at the first smell of gunpowder, back down and let it get away with it? And I don't have a view on how far it'll go. I'm fairly clear about what the intention is, which is to test the limit as far as they can. What I don't know is will Ofcom be a pushover, or will Ofcom actually hold the line? You probably have more of a view.
I think the crucial question. No, I mean, you're right. We'll see. I mean, I'm afraid I'm less optimistic, and I'm not completely convinced that Ofcom has either the personnel or the resources to stand up to the government. But I'm actually more concerned about the impact on the BBC. Because I'm pretty clear. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Cummings made it perfectly clear, and even without him, the impact of these two channels is going to be to shift the editorial and journalistic center of gravity to the right, and the BBC is bound to get caught up in that. I don't see how it can fail, how it could not do. And I think there's going to have to be some very brave journalistic voices at the BBC and we're yet to see whether they'll emerge, who are prepared to say, we're standing by what we consider to be the centre. We're not going down the road of GB News and News UK.
Steve, I'm more optimistic than you in the sense that we know that Daily Mail readers trust the BBC and they don't trust the Mail. I mean, what people get from their newspapers is lots of things which should be primarily accurate news, but they all know that their newspapers are not impartial in the way they choose what to report, and they choose the way they report it. So I think that there's, in a market where people do have a lot of sources of information, I think that the public, this isn't an ideal thing. I very much hope Ofcom does hold the line. And of course the BBC, I mean, we've said the BBC has to be braver on multiple fronts, we've said, and including this one. But I think that the public will smell a rat.
Let me just interrupt. I'm conscious of the time. I'm sure Paul wants to wind up, but let me just interrupt you because I think it's more nuanced than that, Paddy. I'm sure you're right if it's left to the public in terms of is there an obviously biased news? What I'm concerned about is the news agenda. Because what
I agree with that.
news channels can do and what the shock jock stations can do is to say, these are the things that we should be talking about. We should be talking about all these immigrants coming over here. We should be talking about how ridiculously expensive and wasteful the NHS is. That's what we should be talking about. And it's subtle. It's not kind of, we're going to feed you with stuff which is obviously biased. And I agree. I think the public can see through that. It's simply bringing stuff up the agenda and putting other stuff like climate change down the agenda.
Yes, I agree with that. Paul?
Sorry, we agree. That's not a good academic.
So, Steve, many thanks for that. We're coming towards the end. We didn't have as many questions from or time for questions from the audience as we might have liked, but I mean, looking forward, I think sometimes the best way to do that, and following on from Steve's questions as well, sometimes the best way is to look back. I know that you write a chapter on this inglorious period in BBC's history in respect of the general strike. I've got a question from Oliver. I'd like to make this the final one because this relates to that that kind of historical heritage. And he asks this. I'm not being over familiar when I call him Oliver, by the way. He's only listed here with his first name. Can the BBC really hold government to account when it is not allowed to criticise the scientific advice as per Ofcom's 23rd of March note to broadcasters?
I don't know about that note, so I'm surprised if that's what the note said. I mean, I think that the BBC, and this is not just the BBC, I think that it is the job of broadcasters to be impartial and to do a better job on ensuring that where there is a reasonable scientific consensus on any issue, especially an issue that sort of got policy implications, that that view is accurately communicated. And I think it's as simple as that. If the scientific consensus is inconvenient for the government, I mean, I'd be very surprised if Ofcom was sort of suggesting you shouldn't be communicating it. So that certainly isn't my interpretation of the rules, and it certainly isn't my interpretation of the broadcaster's role, not just the BBC, but all broadcasters. We've now with COVID and Brexit is a little bit different because it's the dismal science rather than real science that's which is where there's partly contested. But when it comes to climate science, there are uncertainties, and there is consensus that there are uncertainties, but the broad thrust of climate science is very clear. We need to tackle climate change collectively as a planet, not just one country at a time. And exactly how you do that and get international collaboration, that's seriously difficult. But the science really shouldn't be contested, and the broadcasters should be very clear about that.
Can I just say, Paul, as far as I can remember from that note, unless there was another one, it simply reminded broadcasters of their duty to be accurate and their obligations in terms of the broadcasting code. And I think that was extremely timely and appropriate given the number of conspiracy theories doing the rounds. So I'm surprised that is interpreted as towing the government line. I really don't take that interpretation at all.
Okay, many thanks, colleagues, for reopening the question. I'll have to start to close this meeting, but before I do, I would like to give thanks to to the brilliant questioners, but first of all, my Middlesex colleagues, Paul Carr, Yasmin Alibi-Brown, James Rogers, Sophie Knowles, Kurt Barlin, my Zoom buddy from Middlesex, Asimina Bibe, and then also for opening this, Kenny Iguiano. Then from Royal Holloway, John Ellis, many thanks, and Steve Barnett from University of Westminster. Last but not least, James Rogers. And then finally, and above all, we called for this session to be full of heart following Kenny's introduction, and also to be level-headed. Certainly it was level-headed. Paddy, you've been extremely even-handed, but what strikes me above all in this this symposium that we've had is that you were on top of that committed, passionate, and above all energetic. I don't know how you managed to last through these last 2 hours plus, but you're a one-man antidote to Zoom fatigue.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely superb. Many thanks to everybody and to the attendees. Thank you for your questions and for coming to see this symposium. Take care, everybody.
Thanks,
Have a
Paul.
good evening.
Thank you.